The Devil's Path. Part 1. The Warning. The sun was beginning to set as Jason Miller trudged along the trail. He could feel the weight of the long day on his shoulders. His pack was heavy, the air thick with the earthy scent of pine and wet dirt. Sweat dripped down his brow, despite the cool breeze that occasionally swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint chill that hinted at the coming of night. He didn't mind the exhaustion. The trail was tough, but it was beautiful, and the solitude gave him peace of mind. Peace he hadn't had in years. He had come to the remote forest in the mountains to escape. After the breakup, after the job lost, after the feeling of being trapped in a life that wasn't his own, he needed time away. Just him, the wilderness, and his thoughts. No distractions, no noise, no one to answer to. But as the evening drew near, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was subtle at first, a rustle in the trees, a shift in the wind, a shadow flickering at the edge of his vision. He told himself it was nothing. He was alone in the woods, surrounded by thousands of miles of untouched forest. It was probably just an animal, or his own mind playing tricks on him. As he continued down the trail, his mind wandered back to the warnings he'd heard before he left. The warnings about the Devil's Path. The locals at the nearby town had spoken of it in hushed tones, almost like they were afraid to say it out loud. An old trail that led deep into the woods, known for strange disappearances and eerie happenings. Most people avoided it, and for good reason. It was said that anyone who ventured too far down the path would be lost forever, trapped in a hellish maze that twisted reality itself. Jason had dismissed it all as superstition. He was an educated man, a rational man, the kind of guy who didn't believe in ghost stories or fairy tales. But now, with the sun dipping behind the mountains and the forest growing darker around him, he wasn't so sure. The trail had started innocently enough. Well-marked, well-trodden, it seemed like any other hiking path. But the deeper Jason ventured into the woods, the less familiar it felt. The path grew narrower, the trees thicker, and the ground uneven, as though nature itself was trying to push him off course. It was a trail less traveled. The crunch of his boots on the dirt and rocks seemed to echo unnaturally in the air. The birds that had chirped happily earlier in the day had gone silent. The forest had gone still, almost as though it was holding its breath. Jason paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His phone had no signal, of course. That much was expected. He planned for that. But now, with the trail growing darker, and the silence becoming oppressive, he began to regret not telling anyone where he was going. No one would know if something went wrong. No one would find him. "Pull it together, Jason," he muttered under his breath. "It's just a trail." He continued forward, but something in the pit of his stomach told him that something wasn't right. His footsteps seemed louder now, unnaturally loud in the silence. The wind had stopped entirely, and even the rustle of leaves had disappeared. There was nothing. And then, he saw it. The sign was weathered, old, and barely visible in the fading light, but it was there, lodged between two large rocks. He hadn't seen it before, and yet it had to have been there the entire time. He approached it cautiously, bending down to inspect it. The writing on the sign was faded, scratched and chipped with age, but the words were still legible. The Devil's Path. A chill ran down his spine. Jason stood up slowly, glancing around as if expecting something to jump out at him. What the hell was this doing here? A sense of unease crept into his mind. Maybe the locals weren't just telling stories. Maybe there was something to the warnings. He could feel his heart begin to race, the adrenaline kicking in as his survival instincts kicked into gear. But it was already too late. The trail had already begun to shift. Jason stood there, staring at the sign. And as he stood, the wind suddenly picked up, rustling the trees around him. It was as if the forest was alive, whispering, shifting. And then, as though on cue, the shadows in the woods seemed to grow longer, darker, more intense. He took a step back. His breath came in shallow bursts, and his heartbeat pounded in his chest. What was that? A flicker of movement in the distance caught his eye. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the tree line. Too far for him to see clearly, but close enough that it was unmistakably there. He squinted, trying to make out the shape, but it was no use. The figure was just there, watching. Jason froze, his pulse quickening. His legs were heavy, rooted in place. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to run back to the safety of the town. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent, unmoving. His mind raced. It couldn't be another hiker. The trail had been empty. He'd been alone this whole time. And yet, it was still there. Finally, his legs found the strength to move. He turned and sprinted down the trail, not looking back. The air felt thick now, as if the woods themselves were closing in on him. The shadows reached for him, the trees groaning in the wind as if they were alive. His breaths were ragged, his chest tight, but he couldn't stop. He had to get out. But as he ran, the path seemed to shift. The trees closed in tighter, the shadows darker. The once clear trail twisted, turned into an unfamiliar maze. The ground beneath him felt soft and unstable, and the heavy air seemed to weigh him down with each step. The figure from earlier, it was closer now. He could hear its footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, following him. Jason's eyes darted behind him, but the figure was gone. The woods were silent once more. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed forward, but no matter how fast he ran, the trail seemed to stretch on forever, never leading him out. And then, he saw it again. The sign. It was back. The same sign. The same weathered wood. The same words. The Devil's Path. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. He spun around, the reality of the situation sinking in. He had come full circle. The trail was a loop. He was stuck. And then, he heard it. The whispers. Low at first, just beneath the wind. But it grew louder, like voices speaking in unison. Dozens of voices, overlapping, murmuring in languages he didn't understand. He turned back toward the woods, eyes wide with terror. He could feel the eyes of the forest under him, the weight of something ancient pressing down from all directions. He wasn't alone, and the trail had no end. Part 2, the trail unfolds. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't just the wind anymore. The voices seemed to come from everywhere. The trees, the rocks, the very ground beneath Jason's feet. He could hear them moving around him, circling him, growing louder and more insistent with every passing second. The words were foreign, guttural, and strange, but they had a rhythm to them, an unnerving chant that echoed through his skull. He spun around, his breath shallow and quick, trying to track where the voices were coming from. The forest was still, but it felt alive. Too alive. The trees around him seemed to lean in, their branches twisting like fingers that reached out to grasp him. Jason ran again, his legs burning, but no matter how fast he moved, the trees didn't change. The trail didn't end. It looped back into itself, as if the forest was a maze designed to keep him in. The voices continued. The air grew heavier with each step, suffocating him, pressing on his chest. He couldn't see anything, only trees, thick and ancient, closing in on him. The path itself was barely visible, the soil dark and slick with moisture. Suddenly, the trail opened up. The trees parted like a curtain, revealing a clearing in the woods. At the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, dark and weathered by centuries of neglect. The stone was etched with strange symbols, markings that Jason couldn't understand, but they felt wrong. Evil. The air in the clearing was thick, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of something older than time. Jason's feet slowed, his breath catching in his throat. The whispers still filled his ears, but now they seemed to be coming from the altar itself, as if the stones were alive. He took a step forward. The moment he did, the whispers stopped. A deafening silence followed, so profound it felt as though the forest had stopped breathing entirely. Jason's heart raced. He felt a cold sweat break out across his skin as his eyes locked on the altar. A figure stood in front of it. A man, or at least, what looked like a man. His skin was pale, almost ashen, and his hair was long and wild, like strands of blackened vines twisted around his face. He was tall, unnaturally tall, and his limbs were long and thin, like they had been stretched out of shape. His eyes gleamed a bright, unnatural red, like flames in the darkness. The figure didn't speak, but Jason could feel it, the presence behind him, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream, to flee, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his body frozen in place. And then, the figure opened its mouth. The words that came from its lips were not human. They were the same voices Jason had heard earlier, the guttural, alien language that seemed to tear through his mind, raking at his sanity. It didn't matter what the figure said. It didn't matter that Jason couldn't understand the words. The moment the figure spoke, Jason knew. He knew what this place was. The Devil's Path. It was a gateway. A portal. A place where the veil between worlds was thin. A place where creatures, ancient and powerful, could cross into the human realm. And Jason, unwittingly, had wandered right into it. He jerked back, his feet stumbling as he tried to turn around, but the world around him began to warp. The trees began to twist and stretch, the ground buckling beneath his feet as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. He could hear the whispers again, louder now, pressing in on him from all sides, as if the forest itself was alive and hungry. His heart pounded in his chest. He had to move. He had to escape. But as he turned to run, the figure's voice echoed through the clearing. "It's too late." Jason felt the air around him shift. The world spun, and the path beneath his feet began to unravel. The clearing twisted and stretched into something unrecognizable. The trees began to grow taller, their branches reaching toward the sky like twisted claws, as the ground beneath him cracked open, revealing a deep, yawning abyss. From the darkness below, he could hear something stirring. A low, guttural growl, like the rumble of thunder in the distance. It was getting closer, and as the growl grew louder, a massive shape emerged from the depths of the earth, its form hidden in shadow. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The shape was immense, towering alone. It moved, but not like a creature should. It was fluid, shifting like smoke, but with the bulk and weight of something monstrous. It was coming toward him, and as it moved closer, Jason saw it. A massive head, crowned with horns, its face a twisted mockery of human features. Its eyes were wide, black pools of darkness that seemed to absorb the light, and its mouth split open, revealing row upon row of jagged teeth. The creature's voice rumbled through the air, deep and ancient, shaking the very ground beneath Jason's feet. "You shouldn't have come here, mortal." Jason stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The creature reached out, its long, clawed hand descending toward him, and as it touched the air around him, the world seemed to freeze. The sky turned black, the trees gone, replaced by the yawning void of an endless abyss. The ground cracked open, and Jason was falling. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Part 3: The Abyss Beckons. Jason fell for what felt like an eternity. The air around him grew colder with each passing second. His body weightless, suspended in the dark nothingness, spinning as if caught in an unseen current. His lungs burned as he gasped for breath, the silence of the void pressing in on him from every side. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fall stopped. Jason's feet slammed into the ground with a sickening crunch, the impact rattling through his body. His head spun, but he pushed himself upright, trying to make sense of his surroundings. Where was he? He was no longer in the clearing, no longer on the path. The place was nothing like the forest. The trees had disappeared, replaced by jagged rocks and cold stone. A twisted, impossible landscape stretched before him, endless, barren, and suffocating. The sky above was a sickly hue, a dull, oppressive red, as if the very air was stained with blood. The ground was cracked, fissures running deep into the earth, spewing dark smoke and a faint, putrid odor that made his stomach turn. Jason staggered to his feet, his head throbbing, the disorienting sensation of the fall still clinging to him. His body felt heavy, his limbs slow and sluggish, as if the air itself was pulling him down. A low growl echoed through the air. Jason turned, instinctively reaching for his flashlight, but it was gone. His pack, his equipment, everything had disappeared in the fall. He was alone, standing in the middle of the desolate expanse, with only the ominous silence surrounding him. This was no longer the world he knew. From the dark, a shape emerged. A figure, tall and shrouded in shadow, moved toward him with an unnatural, fluid grace. Its form was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but Jason could feel its presence, the weight of it pressing him. The air grew colder, heavier, as the figure drew closer. Jason's breath quickened, his heart racing in his chest. He tried to step back, but his feet wouldn't obey him. He was frozen in place, locked in the grip of whatever force was at work here. The figure stopped just a few feet away. It was no longer a man, or even a humanoid shape. It was something else. Something ancient. Its eyes glowed faintly, the same oppressive red as the sky above. They seemed to pierce through him, seeing past his skin, past his bones, straight into the core of his soul. The smile that formed on its face wasn't human. It was wide, far too wide, its lips stretching like rubber, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. It spoke. "You should not have come, mortal." The voice was not a voice at all. It was a sensation, vibrating in his skull, a sound that resonated in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just heard. It was felt. Jason tried to speak, to protest, but no words came out. His throat was dry, parched, as if he'd forgotten how to form sentences. The figure leaned closer, its breath cold as death itself, the stench of rot and decay filling the air around him. "You have walked the devil's path, and now you belong here." Jason's knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the ground. Panic seized his chest. This was it. The end. He had heard the stories. He had ignored the warnings. And now there was no escape. The ground beneath him began to tremble, a low, rhythmic thudding that resonated deep within his bones. The darkness around him began to shift, the landscape warping and twisting as the very earth seemed to come alive. Shadows moved, taking shape, forming into figures, hundreds of them. They were human, or they had once been. Their eyes were wide, black and empty. Their mouths hung open, but no sound came from them, only the soft, rattling hiss of their breath. Their limbs were twisted, contorted, and their bodies seemed to shimmer like smoke, flickering between solid and ethereal. They were prisoners. trapped here, lost in this hellish place. Jason's heart raced. He scrambled backward, his eyes darting between the figures that surrounded him. They were closing in, their bodies moving with unnatural, jerking motions, their arms reaching for him, their hands clawing at the air. The figure in front of him, the thing that had spoken, was still watching him. Its grin had grown wider, impossibly wide, stretching across its face as it slowly raised one hand. The air seemed to thicken with its every movement. "Do you know where you are, mortal?" it asked, its voice echoing in his skull. "This is the abyss. The place between the living and the damned. The place where the souls of the lost come to rest, forever." Jason wanted to run. He tried to run, but his body refused to obey. The figures around him were too close now, their hands reaching, their fingers curling into grotesque claws as they crawled toward him. "You're not the first to come here," the figure continued, its grin widening. "And you won't be the last. This path, this trail, you think you've escaped it, but it's already inside you. It always was." Jason's breath caught in his throat. He could feel it now, the weight of something inside him. Something dark. Something that had been growing since the moment he had set foot on the devil's path. This wasn't just a trail. This was a trap. A place where souls were bound, where time and reality bled together, where the living became part of the damned. And he had walked into it. The ground beneath him cracked open. Jason screamed as the earth split wide, a dark chasm opening in front of him. The abyss below him was a void, darker than anything he had ever seen. It wasn't just empty, it was alive. It was pulling him in. The figures around him began to chant in that same guttural language, their voices overlapping, filling the air with a haunting song. Their arms reached for him, their fingers like cold, bony hooks, dragging him closer to the edge. "You will become one of us," the figure said. Its voice was the last thing Jason heard before the darkness swallowed him whole. Jason awoke with a jolt, gasping for air. He was no longer in the abyss. He was back on the devil's path, standing on the edge of the clearing, his heart racing, his body trembling. The sun was low in the sky, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. His pack was still on his back, the weight familiar, as though nothing had changed. But something had. The figure from the clearing, the thing, stood just behind him now, watching him with those red, glowing eyes. It smiled. "You're not the first to escape, Jason, but you'll be the last." The ground beneath his feet trembled again. And this time, Jason knew. The path was never over. It was never finished. Part 4. The Spiral Down. Jason stood frozen on the devil's path, his heart hammering against his ribcage as the figure's voice echoed in his mind, its words sinking deep into his consciousness like barbed wire. "You're not the first to escape, Jason, but you'll be the last." He couldn't speak, couldn't move. His eyes locked with the figures, and the red glow from its eyes seemed to pierce into his soul, flickering like a flame in the dark. It wasn't human. It was something worse, something ancient and twisted, born from the very fabric of the forest itself. He wanted to run. He had to run. The fear in his chest clawed at him, suffocating him, but his legs wouldn't obey. The earth beneath his feet felt wrong, as though it were shifting with every breath he took. The figure, the thing, raised its hand toward him, its fingers long and crooked, stretched unnaturally thin. Its smile grew wider, impossibly wide, the skin around its mouth creasing with the force of it. "You're already part of it, Jason. You've been part of it since the moment you walked the devil's path. You think you can escape? You think you can outrun what's inside you?" A heavy weight pressed down on Jason's chest, as if the air around him had thickened, like he was drowning in the oppressive atmosphere of the woods. The path in front of him seemed to twist, spiraling downward into the earth, beckoning him to step forward. He wanted to fight it. He wanted to scream, to do something. But all he could do was stare, paralyzed by the figure's presence. You were never meant to leave, Jason. The path is endless, and it will pull you back. It will pull you down. And with that, the ground beneath his feet cracked open. The chasm yawned wider, its black maw swallowing everything around it. The ground split apart with a deep, resonating thrum, and Jason was thrown to his knees as the earth seemed to shift beneath him. His arms flailed, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to, but the ground was crumbling. The path was breaking apart. No! Jason screamed, but the words were drowned by the sound of the earth splitting. The figures, those dark, twisted things, were rising from the cracks, emerging from the depths of the ground like demons escaping from hell. Their eyes were wide and black, their mouths open, but no sound came. They didn't need to speak, their presence was enough. Their hands reached for him, fingers outstretched, clawed and desperate. Jason scrambled backward, his heart pounding, his mind screaming at him to run, to find a way out. But there was nowhere to run. The earth was crumbling beneath his feet, the very air seemed to close in around him, and the figures drew closer, their hollow eyes fixed on him. One of them reached out, its fingers brushing his skin, and Jason felt a jolt of coldness shoot through his body. The chill spread like fire through his veins, freezing him in place. The world began to tilt, and the ground beneath him gave way. With one final scream, he was falling into the abyss. Jason awoke with a start. It was silent. His body was no longer in freefall. His head didn't spin. His limbs didn't ache from the impact. Everything was still. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the dim light. His chest heaved as he gasped for breath. He was lying on something soft, not the hard, jagged ground he expected. He looked around. He was no longer on the devil's path. He was in a room. A small, dimly lit room. The walls were made of rough stone, the floor uneven and cold. The only source of light came from a flickering candle in the corner. The air smelled damp, musty, like the earth had not seen the light of day in centuries. Jason pushed himself up, his body trembling with confusion. What had happened? How had he gotten here? The last thing he remembered was the fall. The crack in the ground. The figures, those things that had surrounded him. Was it a dream? Was it real? But no. This place felt real. It felt wrong. The weight of the air, the darkness pressing against the stone walls. It was a physical sensation, like being trapped in the belly of something ancient, something alive. He stood shaking, his legs unsteady beneath him. He wanted to leave, to escape, but there was no door, no window, no way out. And then he heard it, a soft whisper. It was distant at first, barely audible, like a voice coming from behind a wall. But as Jason listened, the whispering grew louder. It was everywhere. It was in the stone, in the air, in the very ground beneath him. The voices, they were speaking his name. Jason. 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 He turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The whispers persisted. And with them came something else. The faintest sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the stone. Jason's breath hitched. He wasn't alone. The footsteps grew closer until they stopped. Jason's heart thundered in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was his mind playing tricks on him, but he felt watched. Something was in the room with him, standing just out of sight. Slowly, he turned toward the source of the sound. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was tall, its form dark and shifting like smoke, its outline barely visible against the dim light. It had no face, no eyes, just a shifting void of shadow, a shape that was too large, too wrong to belong in this place. It was staring at him. Jason could feel its gaze, even though it had no eyes. It was like a pressure against his soul, like it was looking into him. And then the figure spoke, its voice like a low growl. "You thought you could escape, Jason." Jason stepped backward, his body still trembling. What is this? Where am I?" The figure stepped forward, its form flickering like fire in the wind. "This is the end of the path." Jason's heart stopped. He had heard those words before. The devil's path. The abyss. No, this can't be real," Jason muttered, his mind spiraling into panic. The figure tilted its head, an unnerving, inhuman gesture. "It's always real, Jason. It always has been." Jason's world began to tilt again, the floor beneath him cracking open. The whispers intensified, now accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping sound. "It's time for you to join us." The figure lunged forward, faster than Jason could react. Everything went black. Part 5, The Final Descent. Jason woke with a jolt, his body jerking upright as though the very sensation of being pulled from the abyss had snapped him back to life. His breath came in sharp, ragged bursts, and he struggled to calm his racing heart. The darkness around him was thick and suffocating, but there was a faint, glowing light in the distance, a faint, eerie glow that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. His eyes darted frantically, trying to make sense of his surroundings, but there was no familiar sight. No trail. No forest. No sky. Only an endless expanse of stone, stretching out in every direction. He was no longer in the small room he had awoken in earlier. This was something else entirely. The ground beneath him was smooth, cold, and dark. It seemed to shift beneath his feet, as if it were alive. The air was thick, oppressive, and the faint, pulsating glow in the distance only added to the sense that something wasn't right. A sound echoed from the void, a low, rumbling growl, distant but unmistakable. It made Jason's blood run cold. He felt a sharp, instinctual terror crawl into his bones. The ground beneath him trembled again, and the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, grew louder. The very air seemed to vibrate with the weight of it, as though the footsteps were shaking the earth itself. But there was nowhere to hide, no place to run. He was trapped in this endless, God-forsaken place. Then the figure appeared. It was the same shadowy shape that had haunted him before, the faceless, shifting form that had appeared in the doorway. But now, it was different. More solid, more real. It stood at the far edge of the globe, an imposing silhouette against the faint light. Its shape was incomprehensible, a mixture of smoke and shadow that refused to take a definitive form. Its edges flickered, twisting and distorting, like something trying to hold together, but always slipping apart. And then it spoke. "You've come so far, Jason." The voice was a deep rumble that reverberated through the ground, shaking Jason's very core. The air thickened, the weight of it pressing down on him like a physical force. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. "What do you want from me?" His voice was hoarse, his throat dry, but he forced the words out. "I don't belong here. This isn't real." The figure tilted its head, its form contorting unnaturally, as if it were considering him. Then it took a step forward. Jason tried to back away, but his feet were rooted to the ground, as though the stone beneath him had grown into his flesh. He couldn't move. The figure loomed closer, its presence filling the space, suffocating him. "You were always meant to be here, Jason." From the moment you set foot on the devil's path, you were marked. You belong to the path now. You always have. The words sent a cold shiver down his spine. His heart pounded. The truth of it started to sink in. He had been chosen. He had been dragged here, pulled into this thing, this path, this place that was both real and unreal. He had walked the trail, taken each step blindly, and now there was no escape. No! Jason yelled, his voice breaking. He pulled against the invisible force holding him in place, but it was useless. I can't be, this can't be happening. The figure's grin widened, though it had no real face. The void where its eyes should have been seemed to expand, filling Jason's vision with nothing but blackness. You wanted to escape, but you're still here, Jason. You always will be. The growl came again, but this time it wasn't just distant, it was right behind him. Jason spun around, but there was nothing. Only the faint glow, pulsing steadily. He took a step back, his heart racing as the sound grew louder, closer. A shape, massive and shifting, emerged from the shadows, too large to comprehend. Its form was jagged, its edges like flames, flickering and warping in and out of existence. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The air grew heavier, and the temperature dropped. It was a creature of pure shadow, its body stretched impossibly wide, its limbs twisted and cracked. Its face, if it could be called that, was an empty void, an endless black hole that seemed to pull at Jason's soul. It moved toward him, its footsteps echoing like thunder. Each step caused the ground to shake violently. Jason's legs were like lead. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend what he was seeing, but all he could feel was that overpowering pull, the pull of the abyss. The creature reached out, its enormous clawed hand extending toward him, each finger impossibly long, each joint cracking like thunder. Its fingers curled around Jason's throat with terrifying speed. Jason gasped, choking as the grip tightened. "You are mine now," the creature rumbled, its voice like 1,000 screams. "This place is your prison. This place is your eternity." His body spasmed, his breath growing shallow, but even as the darkness closed in around him, he fought to remain conscious. No. He refused to give in. With what little strength he had left, Jason summoned every ounce of his willpower. His fingers twitched, then clenched into fists. He pushed against the creature's hand, fighting, trying to claw his way back to some semblance of control. And in that moment, something clicked. A jolt of raw energy surged through his body, sparking from the deepest part of his being. It wasn't physical strength. It wasn't power. It was the last vestige of his humanity, fighting against the weight of the abyss. The creature's grip loosened, and with a gasp, Jason pulled away, stumbling backward. His feet hit the ground, and he fell, landing hard. But when he looked up, the creature was gone. The figure that had spoken to him was also gone. The world around him was silent. The glow had disappeared. For a moment, Jason thought maybe he had imagined it all. Maybe he had never really fallen. Maybe he hadn't really walked the devil's path. Maybe the forest was just a trail, and the darkness was just his fear, his mind playing tricks on him. But when he stood and turned to face the endless void again, he saw it. The trail. The path was still there, stretching forward into the distance. But it wasn't the same path he had walked before. This was darker, twisted, a jagged path that cut through the earth like a wound. It was waiting for him. And no matter how far he ran, it would always call him back. Because the devil's path was never finished.